Coming at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is the Rant. I am your host, Charles Lamson. All right, well, today is Tuesday, 6th day of August, year of our Lord, 2019. Today's topic going to be part 4 of economic management. Economic management, maximizing organizational effectiveness. First half of the big show, we're going to have a seance. We're going to summon the spirit of Alfred Marshall. He's going to talk about via a team of crack mediums. So if you happen to hear a female's voice, that's a female medium channeling the spirit of Alfred Marshall. Of course, he's a famous English economist from back the turn of the last century. I guess this is written in about 1890, something like that. Or not written, I mean, that's when he wrote Principles of Economics, but his spirit is going to be reading from his work, Principles of Economics, and he's going to be speaking through a team of gifted mediums and psychics who I managed to wrangle together for this very show. So we're going to do that the first half of the show, and we're also going to have a motivational, inspirational 50-year-old disabled guy instructional tips going on. I'm going to do a little instructional video. That's where I, in the spirit of proactivity, I kind of meshed together my workout time. Whilst I'm listening to Alfred Marshall, whilst I'm sharing it with you and doing my thing on YouTube, my thing on Blog Talk Radio, and it makes for great blog material, which it's on the blog as well. By the way, So hey, if you like the show, hit like and subscribe. Keep coming back. And okay, so so like I said, we're doing a simulcast. We're on blogtalkradio.com and YouTube, and okay. Anyway, so yeah, like I said, like I said, I'm going to be doing a little instructional video, fitness instructional video, motivational, inspirational. And my deal is I work out for about, 45, 50 minutes. But I just go light, very light. So I use 10-pound therapeutic bar. And then my goal is just kind of try and keep moving 45, 50 minutes. I take breaks in between sets, count 30 respirations. That's about 60 seconds in between each set. So then after the first half of the show, I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about management and performance management, to be more precise. And so I'm going to be giving away tips and secrets, strategies, and tactics that people pay big bucks for. Going to fancy schmancy graduate schools for their MBAs and what have you. So, and I'm going to share it with you free of charge, just to spread goodwill throughout the land. Okay, so that being said, it's time to summon the spirit of Alfred Marshall. Alfred, please come to us. Teach us your principles of economics. Please help us. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Principles of Economics,
okay.
Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 5, by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 1, Preliminary Survey of Distribution. The keynote of this book is in the fact that free human beings are not brought up to their work on the same principles as a machine, a horse, or a slave. If they were, there would be very little difference between the distribution and the exchange side of value, for every agent of production would reap a return adequate to cover its own expenses of production with wear and tear, etc., at all events after allowance had been made for causal failures to adjust supply and demand. But as it is, our growing power over nature makes her yield an ever larger surplus above necessaries, and this is not absorbed by an unlimited increase of the population. There remain therefore the questions: what are the general causes which govern the distribution of this surplus among the people? What part is played by conventional necessaries, i.e., the standard of comfort? What by the influence which methods of consumption and of living generally exert on efficiency, by wants and activities, i.e., by the standard of life? What by the many-sided action of the principle of substitution, and by the struggle for survival between hand workers and brain workers of different classes and grades? What by the power which the use of capital gives to those in whose hands it is? What share of the general flow is turned to remunerate those who work, including here the undertaking of ventures, and wait as contrasted with those who work and consume at once the fruits of their endeavors? An attempt is made to give a broad answer to those and some similar questions. We shall begin a preliminary survey of the subject by noting how French and English writers a century ago represented value as governed almost wholly by cost of production, demand taking a subordinate place. Next, we shall observe how near to the truth these results would be in a stationary state, and what corrections need to be introduced in order to bring these results into harmony with the actual conditions of life and work. And thus, the remainder of Chapter 1 will be given mainly to the demand for labor. In Chapter 2, we shall first consider its supply under modern conditions, and thence we shall turn to a general view of the causes which fix the broad lines of distribution of the national income between labor and the owners of capital and land. In this rapid survey, we shall pass by unnoticed many details. To fill in some of these is the task of the remainder of the book, but others must stand over for a later volume. The simplest account of the causes which determine the distribution of the national income is that given by the French economists who just preceded Adam Smith, and it is based upon the peculiar circumstances of France in the latter half of the last century. The taxes and other exactions levied from the French peasant were then limited only by his ability to pay, and a few of the laboring classes were far from starvation. So, the economists, or physiocrats as they were called, assumed for the sake of simplicity that there was a natural law of population according to which the wages of labor were kept at a limit. They did not suppose that this was true of the whole working population, but the exceptions were few, so that they thought the general impression given by their assumption was true. Somewhat in the same way as it is well to begin an account of the shape of the earth by saying that it is an oblate spheroid, although a few mountains do project as much as 1,000th part of its radius beyond the general level. Again, they knew that the rate of interest in Europe had fallen during the 5 preceding centuries, in consequence of the fact that economy had generally prevailed over luxury. But they were impressed very much by the sensitiveness of capital and the quickness with which it evaded the oppressions of the tax-gatherer by retiring from his grasp, and they therefore concluded that there was no great violence in the supposition that if its profits were reduced below what they then were, capital would speedily be consumed or migrate. Accordingly, they assumed, again for the sake of simplicity, that there was something like a natural or necessary rate of profit, corresponding in some measure to the natural rate of wages, that if the current rate exceeded this necessary level, capital would grow rapidly till it forced down the rate of profit to that level, and that if the current rate went below that level, capital would shrink quickly and the rate would be forced upwards again. They thought that, wages and profits being thus fixed by natural laws, the natural value of everything was governed simply as the sum of wages and profits required to remunerate the producers. Adam Smith worked out this conclusion more fully than the physiocrats did, though it was left for Ricardo to make clear that the labor and capital needed for production must be estimated at the margin of cultivation, so as to avoid the element of rent. But Adam Smith saw also that labor and capital were not at the verge of starvation in England as they were in France. In England, the wages of a great part of the working class were sufficient to allow much more than the mere necessaries of existence, and capital had too rich and too safe a field of employment there to be likely to go out of existence or to emigrate. So, when he is carefully weighing his words, his use of the terms the natural rate of wages and the natural rate of profit has not that sharp definition and fixedness which it had in the mouths of the physiocrats, and he goes a good way towards explaining how they are determined by the ever-fluctuating conditions of demand and supply. He even insists that the liberal reward of labor increases the industry of the common people, that a plentiful subsistence increases the bodily strength of the laborer, and the comfortable hope of bettering his condition, and of ending his days, perhaps, in ease and plenty, animates him to exert that strength to the utmost. Where wages are high, accordingly, we shall always find the workman more active, diligent, and expeditious than where they are low. In England, for example, than in Scotland, in the neighborhood of great towns than in the remote country places. And yet he sometimes falls back into the old way of speaking, and thus makes careless readers suppose that he believes the mean level of the wages of labor to be fixed by an iron law at the bare necessaries of life. Malthus, again, in his admirable survey of the course of wages in England from the 13th to the 18th centuries, shows how their mean level oscillated from century to century, falling sometimes down to about half a peck of corn a day, and rising sometimes up to a peck and a half, or even, in the 15th century, to about 2 pecks. But although he observes that an inferior mode of living may be a cause as well as a consequence of poverty, he traces this effect almost exclusively to the consequent increase of numbers. He does not anticipate the stress which economists of our own generation lay on the influence which habits of living exercise on the efficiency and therefore on the earning power of the laborer. Ricardo's language is even more unguarded than that of Adam Smith and Malthus. It is true, indeed, that he says distinctly, "It is not to be understood that the natural price of labor estimated in food and necessaries is absolutely fixed and constant. It essentially depends on the habits and customs of the people." But having said this once, he does not take the trouble to repeat it constantly, and most of his readers forget that he says it. In the course of his argument, he frequently adopts a mode of speaking similar to that of Turgot and the physiocrats, and seems to imply that the tendency of population to increase rapidly as soon as wages rise above the bare necessaries of life causes wages to be fixed by a natural law to the level of these bare necessaries. This law has been called, especially in Germany, Ricardo's iron or brazen law. Many German socialists believe that this law is in operation now, even in the Western world, and that it will continue to be so as long as the plan on which production is organized remains capitalistic or individualistic, and they claim Ricardo as an authority on their side. In fact, however, Ricardo was not only aware that the necessary or natural limit of wages was fixed by no iron law, but is determined by the local conditions and habits of each place and time. He was further keenly sensitive to the importance of a higher standard of living, and called on the friends of humanity to exert themselves to encourage the growth of a resolve among the working classes not to allow their wages to fall anywhere near the bare necessaries of life. The persistency with which many writers continue to attribute to him a belief in the iron law can be accounted for only by his delight in imagining strong cases, and his habit of not repeating a hint, which he had once given, that he was omitting for the sake of simplicity the conditions and limitations that were needed to make his results applicable to real life. Mill did not make any great advance in the theory of wages beyond his predecessors, in spite of the care with which he set himself to emphasize the distinctly human element in economics. He, however, followed Malthus in dwelling on those lessons of history which show that, if a fall of wages caused the laboring classes to lower their standard of comfort, the injury done to them will be permanent, and their deteriorated condition will become a new minimum, tending to perpetuate itself as the more ample minimum did before. But it was only in the last generation that a careful study was begun to be made of the effects that high wages have in increasing the efficiency not only of those who receive them, but also of their children and grandchildren. In this matter, the lead has been taken by Walker and other American economists, and the application of the comparative method of study to the industrial problems of different countries of the old and new worlds is forcing constantly more and more attention to the fact that highly paid labor is generally efficient and therefore not dear labor, a fact which, though it is more full of hope for the future of the human race than any other that is known to us, will be found to exercise a very complicating influence on the theory of distribution. It has now become certain that the problem of distribution is more difficult than it was thought to be by earlier economists, and that no solution of it which claims to be simple can be true. Most of the old attempts to give an easy answer to it were really answers to imaginary questions that might have arisen in other worlds than ours, in which the conditions of life were not very simple. The work done in answering these questions was not wasted, for a very difficult problem can be best solved by being broken up into pieces, and each of these simple questions contained a part of the great and difficult problem which we have to solve. Let us profit by this experience and work our way by successive steps in the remainder of this chapter towards understanding the general causes which govern the demand for labor and capital in real life. Let us begin by studying the influence of demand on the earnings of labor, drawn from an imaginary world in which everyone owns the capital that aids him in his labor, so that the problem of the relations of capital and labor do not arise in it. That is, let us suppose but little capital to be used, while everyone owns whatever capital he does use, and the gifts of nature are so abundant that they are free and unappropriated. Let us suppose further that everyone is not only of equal capacity, but of equal willingness to work, and does in fact work equally hard. Also that all work is unskilled, or rather unspecialized in this sense, that if any two people were to change occupations, each would do as much and as good work as the other had done. Lastly, let us suppose that everyone produces things ready for sale without the aid of others, and that he himself disposes of them to their ultimate consumers, so that the demand for everything is direct. In this case, the problem of value is very simple. Things exchange for one another in proportion to the labor spent in producing them. If the supply of any one thing runs short, it may for a little time sell for more than its normal price. It may exchange for things the production of which had required more labor than it had. But if so, the people will at once leave other work to produce it, and in a very short time its value will fall to the normal level. There may be slight temporary disturbances, but as a rule, anyone's earnings will be equal to those of anyone else. In other words, each will have an equal share in the net sum total of things and services produced, or, as we may say, the national income or dividend, which will constitute the demand for labor. If now a new invention doubles the efficiency of work in any trade, so that a man can make twice as many things of a certain kind in a year without requiring additional appliances, then those things will fall to half their old exchange value. The effective demand for everyone's labor will be a little increased, and the share which each can draw from the common earnings stream will be a little larger than before. He may, if he chooses, take twice as many things of this particular kind, together with his old allowance of other things, or he may take somewhat more than before of everything. If there be an increase in the efficiency of production in many trades, the common earnings stream or dividend will be considerably larger. The commodities produced by those trades will constitute a considerably larger demand for those produced by others, and increase the purchasing power of everyone's earnings. Nor will the position be greatly changed if we suppose that some specialized skill is required in each trade, provided other things remain as before. That is, provided the workers are still supposed to be all of equal capacity in industry, and all trades to be equally agreeable and equally easy to be learnt. The normal rate of earnings will still be the same in all trades, for if a day's labor in one trade produces things that sell for more than a day's labor in others, and this inequality shows any signs of lasting, people will bring up their children by preference to the favored trade. It is true that there may be some slight irregularities. The drifting from one trade to another must occupy time, and some trades may, for a while, get more than their normal share of the earnings stream, while others get less or even lack work. But in spite of these disturbances, the current value of everything will fluctuate about its normal value, which will in this case, as in the preceding, depend simply on the amount of labor spent on the thing, for the normal value of all kinds of labor will still be equal. The productive power of the community will have been increased by the division of labor. The common national dividend or earning stream will be larger, and as all will, putting aside passing disturbances, share alike in it, each will be able to buy with the fruits of his own labor things more serviceable to him than he could have produced for himself. In this stage, as in those considered before, it is still true that the value of each thing corresponds closely to the amount of labor spent upon it, and that the earnings of everyone are governed simply by the bounty of nature and by the progress of the arts of production. Next, let us still neglect the influence which the liberty of the expenditure on rearing and training workers exerts on their efficiency, leaving that matter to be discussed with other aspects of the supply side of distribution in the next chapter. And let us look at the influences that changes in the numbers of population exert on the incomes which nature will yield. We suppose then that the growth of population proceeds at a rate which is either fixed or at all events not affected by the rate of wages. It may be influenced by changes in custom, in moral opinion, and in medical knowledge. And we still suppose all labor to be of the same grade, and the national dividend to be divided out equally to each family, save for some slight passing inequalities. In this case, every improvement in the arts of production or transport, every new discovery, every new victory over nature will increase equally the comforts and luxuries at the command of each family. But this case differs from the last, because in this case, the increase of population, if maintained long enough, must ultimately outgrow the improvements in the arts of production and cause the law of diminishing return to assert itself in agriculture. That is to say, those who work on the land will get less wheat and other produce in return for their labor and capital. An hour's labor will represent a less quantity of wheat than before throughout the agricultural trades, and therefore throughout all other trades, since all labor is supposed to be of the same grade, and earnings are therefore, as a rule, equal in all trades. Further, we must note that the surplus or rental value of land will tend to rise, for the value of any kind of produce must equal that of the labor, aided on our supposition by a uniform quantity of capital throughout, which is required to produce it, whether on good land or bad, under barely remunerative or marginal conditions. More labor and capital than before will be needed to raise a quarter of wheat, etc., on the margin, and therefore the wheat, etc., which is returned by nature to the labor applied under advantageous circumstances, will have a higher value relatively to that labor and capital than before, or in other words, it will yield a larger surplus value over that of the labor and capital used in raising it. Now, let us drop the supposition that labor is so mobile as to ensure equal remuneration for equal efforts throughout the whole of society, and let us approach much nearer to the actual condition of life by supposing that labor is not all of one industrial grade, but of several. Let us suppose that parents always bring up their children to an occupation in their own grade, that they have free choice within that grade, but not outside it. Lastly, let us suppose that the increase of numbers in each grade is governed by other than economic causes, as before it may be fixed, or it may be influenced by changes in custom, in moral opinion, etc. In this case also, the aggregate national dividend will be governed by the abundance of nature's return to man's work in the existing state of the arts of production, but the distribution of that dividend between the different grades will be unequal. It will be governed by the demand of the people themselves. The share of those in any industrial compartment will be the higher, the more extensive and urgent the needs which they are able to satisfy on the part of those who are themselves drawing large shares of the national income. Suppose, for instance, artists to form a grade or caste or industrial compartment by themselves, then, their number being fixed, or at least controlled by causes independent of their earnings will be governed by the resources and the eagerness of those classes of the population who care for such gratifications as artists can furnish. We may now leave the imaginary world, in which everyone owns the capital that aids him in his work, and return to our own, where the relation of labor and capital play a great part in the problem of distribution. But let us still confine our attention to the distribution of the national dividend among the various agents of production, in accordance with the quantity of each agent and the service which it renders, and leave the reflex influence which the remuneration of each agent exerts on the supply of that agent to be considered in the next chapter. We have seen how the alert businessman is ever seeking for the most profitable application of his resources and endeavoring to make use of each several agent of production up to that margin or limit at which he would gain by transferring a small part of his expenditure to some other agent, and how he is thus, so far as his influence goes, the medium through which the principle of substitution adjusts the employment of each agent, that, in its marginal application, its cost is proportionate to the additional net produce resulting from its use. We have to apply this general reasoning to the case of the hire of labor. A question constantly on the mind of the careful businessman is whether he has the right number of men for his work. In some cases, that is settled for him by his plant. There must be one and only one engine driver on each express locomotive. But some express trains have only one guard, and when the traffic is heavy, they may lose a few minutes which could be saved by a second guard. Therefore, an alert manager is constantly weighing the net product in saving of time and of annoyance to passengers that will accrue from the aid of a second guard on an important train, and considering whether it will be worth its cost. This question is similar in kind too, but simpler in form than the question whether it would pay to put an additional train on the timetable, which would call for more expenditure on plant as well as on labor. Again, one sometimes hears it said that a certain farmer starves his land for labor. Perhaps he has enough horses and plant, but if he took on another man, he would get his money back, and a good deal more. That is, the net product of an additional man would more than cover his wages. Let us suppose that a farmer is raising such a question as to the number of his shepherds. For simplicity, we may suppose that an additional man would not require any further expenditure on plant or stock, that he would save the farmer himself just as much trouble in some ways as he gives in others, so that nothing has to be allowed for earnings of management, even when these are interpreted broadly so as to include insurance against risk, etc. And lastly, that the farmer reckons that he would do just as much in preventing the wastage of lambs, and in other ways it will increase by 20 his annual output of sheep in good condition. That is to say, he reckons that the net product of an additional man will be 20 sheep. If he can be got for much less than the equivalent of their price, the alert farmer will certainly hire him. But if only for about that price, the farmer will be on the margin of doubt, and the man may then be called a marginal shepherd because his employment is marginal. It is best to assume throughout that the man is of normal efficiency. He would indeed be the marginal shepherd even if he were of exceptional efficiency, provided only that his net produce were equal to his wages. The farmer might have reckoned that a shepherd of normal efficiency would have added only 16 sheep to output, and therefore have been willing to hire this man at a quarter more than the ordinary wages. But to assume him to be thus exceptional would be most inexpedient. He should be representative, that is, of normal efficiency. If he is representative and his employer is representative, the 20 sheep will represent the net product and therefore the earning power of a shepherd. But if the employer is a bad manager, if, for instance, he lets his men run short of necessaries for the sheep, the man may save only 15 sheep instead of 20. Net product tends to represent normal wages only if the worker and his conditions of employment are both normal. The additional product to be got by this shepherd's labor is largely influenced by the number of shepherds whom the farmer already employs. And this again is governed by general conditions of demand and supply, and especially by the number of those from whom the ranks of shepherds could have been recruited during the current generation, by the demand for mutton and wool, and by the area from which supplies of them can be obtained, by the effectiveness of the shepherds on all other farms, and so on. And the amount of the marginal product is further largely influenced by the competition of other uses for land. The space available for sheep farming is curtailed by the demand for land for growing timber or oats, preserving deer, etc. This illustration has been chosen from a simple industry, but though the form may be different, the substance of the problem is the same in every industry. Subject to conditions which are indicated in the footnote, but which are not important for our main purpose, the wages of every class of labor tend to be equal to the net product due to the additional labor of the marginal laborer of that class. This doctrine has sometimes been put forward as a theory of wages, but there is no valid ground for any such pretension. The doctrine that the earnings of a worker tend to be equal to the net product of his work has by itself no real meaning, since in order to estimate net product, we have to take for granted all the expenses of production of the commodity on which he works, other than his own wages. But though this objection is valid against a claim that it contains a theory of wages, it is not valid against a claim that the doctrine throws into clear light the action of one of the causes that govern wages. In later chapters, we shall need to take other illustrations for special purposes of the principle illustrated in the last section from the case of manual labor, and in particular to show how the value of some parts of the work of business management can be measured when it is found that the effective output of a business is increased as much by some additional superintendents as it would be by the hire of an additional ordinary worker. Again, the earnings of a machine can sometimes be estimated by the addition to the output of a factory, which it might effect in certain cases without involving any incidental extra expense. Generalizing from the work of a particular machine to that of machinery of a given aggregate value, we may suppose that in a certain factory, an extra 100 pounds worth of machinery can be applied so as not to involve any other extra expense, and so as to add annually 4 pounds worth to the net output of the factory, after allowing for its own wear and tear. If the investors of capital push it into every occupation into which it seems likely to gain a high reward, and if after this has been done and equilibrium has been found, it still pays and only just pays to employ this machinery, we can infer from this fact that the yearly rate of interest is 4%. But illustrations of this kind merely indicate part of the action of the great causes which govern value. They cannot be made into a theory of interest any more than into a theory of wages without reasoning in a circle. It may, however, be well to carry a little further our illustration of the nature of the demand for capital for any use, and to observe the way in which the aggregate demand for it is made up of the demands for many different uses. To fix the ideas, let us take some particular trade, say that of hat making, and inquire what determines the amount of capital which it absorbs. Suppose that the rate of interest is 4% per annum on perfectly good security, and that the hat making trade absorbs a capital of 1 million pounds. This implies that the hat making trade can turn the whole £1,000,000 worth of capital to so good account that they would pay 4% per annum net for the use of it rather than to go without any of it. Some things are necessary to them, such as tools and perhaps a little machinery. And though competition prevents anything more than the ordinary trade profit being got by the use of this necessary capital, yet the loss of it would be so injurious that those in the trade would have been willing to pay 50% on it if they could not have got the use of it on easier terms. There may be other machinery which the trade would have refused to dispense with if the rate of interest had been 20% per annum, but not if it had been higher. If the rate had been, still more would have been used. If it had been 6%, still more. If 5%, still more. And finally, the rate being 4%, they use more still. When they have this amount, the marginal utility of the machinery, i.e., the utility of that machinery, which it is only just worth their while to employ, is measured by 4%. A rise in the rate of interest would diminish their use of machinery, for they would avoid the use of all that did not give a net annual surplus of more than 4% on its value. And a fall in the rate of interest would lead them to demand the aid of more capital and to introduce machinery which gave a net annual surplus of something less than 4% on its value. Again, the lower the rate of interest, the more substantial will be the style of building used for the hat-making factories and the homes of hat makers, and a fall in the rate of interest will lead to the employment of more capital in the hat-making trade in the form of larger stocks of raw material and of the finished commodity in the hands of retail dealers. The methods in which capital will be applied may vary much even within the same trade. Each undertaker, having regard to his own means, will push the investment of capital in his business in each several direction until what appears in his judgment to be the margin of profitableness is reached. And that margin is, as we have said, a boundary line cutting one after another every possible line of investment and moving irregularly outwards in all directions whenever there is a fall in the rate of interest at which extra capital can be obtained. Thus, the demand for the loan of capital is the aggregate of the demands of all individuals in all trades, and it obeys a law similar to that which holds for the sale of commodities, just as there is a certain amount of a commodity which can find purchasers at any given price. When this price rises, the amount that can be sold diminishes, and so it is with regard to the use of capital. And as with borrowings for productive purposes, so with those of spendthrifts or governments who mortgage their future resources in order to obtain the means of immediate expenditure. It is true that their actions are often but little governed by cool circulation, and that they frequently decide how much they want to borrow with but little reference to the price they will have to pay for the loan. But still, the rate of interest exercises a perceptible influence on borrowings even of this kind. To sum up the whole in a comprehensive, if difficult statement, every agent of production, land, machinery, skilled labor, unskilled labor, etc., tends to be applied in production as far as it profitably can be. If employers and other businessmen think that they can get a better result by using a little more of any one agent, they will do so. They estimate the net product, that is, the net increase of the money value of the total output after allowing for incidental expenses, that will be got by a little more outlay in this direction, or a little more outlay in that. And if they can gain by shifting a little of their outlay from one direction to another, they will do so. Thus, then, the uses of each agent of production are governed by the general conditions of demand in relation to supply. That is, on the one hand, by the urgency of all the uses to which the agent can be put, taken together with the means at the command of those who need it, and on the other hand, by the available stocks of it. And equality is maintained between its values for each use by the constant tendency to shift it from uses in which its services are of less value to others in which they are of greater value, in accordance with the principle of substitution. If less use is made of unskilled labor or any agent, the reason will be that at some point at which people were on the margin of doubt whether it was worthwhile to use that agent, they have decided that it is not worth their while. That is what is meant by saying that we must watch the marginal uses and the marginal efficiency of each agent. We must do so simply because it is only at the margin that any of those shiftings can occur by which changing relations of supply and demand manifest themselves. If we neglected differences between the grades of labor and regarded all labor as of one kind, or at least as all expressed in terms of a certain kind of labor of standard efficiency, we might look for the margin of indifference between the direct application of labor and that of material capital. And we might say shortly, to quote von Thunen's words, that efficiency of capital must be the measure of its earnings, since if the labor of the capital were cheaper than that of the men, the undertaker would dismiss some of his workmen, and in the opposite case, he would increase their number. But, of course, the increased competition of capital in general for employment is of a different character from the competition of machinery for employment in any single trade. The latter may push a particular kind of labor out of employment altogether. The former cannot displace labor in general, for it must cause an increased employment of the makers of those things which are used as capital. And in fact, the substitution of capital for labor is really the substitution of labor, combined with much waiting, in the place of other forms of labor combined with little waiting. When we speak of the national dividend, or distributable net income of the whole nation, as divided into the shares of land, labor, and capital, we must be clear as to what things we are including and what things we are excluding. It will seldom make very much difference to our argument whether we use all the terms broadly or all the terms narrowly. But it is essential that our usage should be consistent throughout any one argument, and that whatever is included on one side of the account of the demand for and supply of land, labor, and capital should be included also on the other. The labor and capital of the country, acting on its natural resources, produce annually a certain net aggregate of commodities, material and immaterial, including services of all kinds. The limiting word net is needed to provide for the using up of raw and half-finished commodities, and for the wearing out and depreciation of plant which is involved in production. All such waste must, of course, be deducted from the gross produce before the true or net income can be found. And net income due on account of foreign investments must be added in. See above, Part 2, Chapter 4, Paragraph 6. This is the true net annual income or revenue of the country, or the national dividend. We may, of course, estimate it for a year or for any other period. The terms national income and national dividend are convertible. Only the latter is the more significant when we are looking at the national income in the character of the sum of the new sources of enjoyments that are available for distribution. But it is best here to follow the common practice and not to count as part of the national income or dividend anything that is not commonly counted as part of the income of the individual. Thus, unless anything is said to the contrary, the services which a person renders to himself and those which he renders gratuitously to members of his family or friends, the benefits which he derives from using his own personal goods, or public property, such as toll-free bridges, are not reckoned as parts of the national dividend, but are left to be accounted for separately. Some part of production goes to increase the stock of raw material, machinery, etc., and does not merely replace material that has been used up or machinery that has been worn out. And this part of the national income or dividend does not pass direct into personal consumption. But it does pass into consumption in the broader sense of the term, which is commonly used by, say, a manufacturer of printing machines, when some of his stock is sold to printers. And in this broad sense, it is true that all production is for consumption, that the national dividend is convertible with the aggregate of net production and also with the aggregate of consumption. Under ordinary conditions of industry, production and consumption move together. There is no consumption except that for which the way has been prepared by appropriate production, and all production is followed by the consumption for which it was designed. There may indeed be some miscalculation in particular branches of production, and a collapse of commercial credit may fill nearly all warehouses for a time with unsold goods. But such conditions are exceptional and are not within our present view. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Principles of Economics, Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Principles of Economics, Book 6, by Alfred Marshall. Chapter 2, Preliminary Survey of Distribution, continued. As was indicated at the beginning of the last chapter, we are now to supplement the study of the influence of demand on distribution by a study of the reflex influence of remuneration on the supply of different agents of production. We have to combine the two in a preliminary general view of the parts played by cost of production and by utility or desirability in governing the distribution of the national dividend between different kinds of labor and the owners of capital and land. Ricardo and the able businessmen who followed in his wake took the operation of demand too much for granted as a thing which did not need to be explained. They did not emphasize it nor study it with sufficient care, and this neglect has caused much confusion and has obscured important truths. In the reaction, too much insistence has been laid on the fact that the earnings of every agent of production come from and are for the time mainly governed by the value of the product which it takes part in producing, its earnings being so far governed on the same principle as the rent of land, and some have even thought it possible to constitute a complete theory of distribution out of a multifold application of the law of rent. But they will not reach to that end. Ricardo and his followers seem to have been rightly guided by their intuitions when they silently determined that the forces of supply were those, the study of which is the more urgent and involves the greater difficulty. When we inquire into what it is that governs the marginal efficiency of a factor of production, whether it be any kind of labor or material capital, we find that the immediate solution requires a knowledge of the available supply of that factor. For if the supply is increased, the thing will be applied to uses for which it is less needed and in which it is less efficient. And the ultimate solution requires a knowledge also of the causes that determine that supply. The nominal value of everything, whether it be a particular kind of labor or capital or anything else, rests, like the keystone of an arch, balanced in equilibrium between the contending pressures of its two opposing sides. The forces of demand press on the one side, and those of supply on the other. The production of everything, whether an agent of production or a commodity ready for immediate consumption, is carried forward up to that limit or margin at which there is equilibrium between the forces of demand and supply. The amount of the thing and its price, the amounts of the several factors or agents of production used in making it, and their prices, all these elements mutually govern one another, and if an external cause should alter any one of them, the effect of the disturbance extends to all the others. In the same way, when several balls are lying in a bowl, they mutually govern one another's positions. And again, when a heavy weight is suspended by several elastic strings of different strengths and lengths, all of them being stretched, attached to different points on the ceiling, the equilibrium positions of all the strings and of the weight mutually govern one another. If any one of the strings is shortened, everything else will change its position, and the length and the tension of every other string will be altered also. We have seen that the effective supply of any agent of production at any time depends firstly on the stock of it in existence, and secondly on the willingness of those in whose charge it is to apply it in production. This willingness is not decided simply by the immediate return which is expected, though there may be a lower limit, which in some cases may be described as a prime cost, below which no work will be done at all. A manufacturer, for instance, has no hesitation in declining to put his machinery in motion for an order that will not cover the extra direct money outlay caused by the work, together with the actual wear and tear of the machinery, while there are somewhat similar considerations with regard to the wear and tear of the worker's own strength, and to the fatigue and other discommodities of his work. And though for the present we are concerned with cost and remuneration under normal conditions, rather than with the direct cost to the individual of any particular piece of work that he does, yet it may be well to make a short statement on the subject here in order to avoid misconceptions. It has already been noticed that when a man is fresh and eager and doing work of his own choice, it really costs him nothing. For, as some socialists have urged with pardonable exaggeration, few people know how much they enjoy moderate work, till something occurs to prevent them from working altogether. But rightly or wrongly, most persons believe that the greater part of the work which they do, when earning their living, yields them no surplus of pleasure, but on the contrary costs them something. They are glad when the hour for stopping arrives. Perhaps they forget that the earlier hours of their work have not cost them as much as the last. They are rather apt to think of 9 hours' work as costing them 9 times as much as the last hour, and it seldom occurs to them to think of themselves as reaping a producer's surplus or rent through being paid for every hour at a rate sufficient to compensate them for the last and most distressing hour. The longer a man works, or even is on duty, the greater is his desire for a respite, unless indeed he has become numbed by his work, while every hour's additional work gives him more pay and brings him nearer to the stage at which his most urgent wants are satisfied, and the higher the pay, the sooner this stage is reached. It depends then on the individual whether with growing pay new wants arise and new desires to provide comforts for others or for himself in after years, or he is soon satiated with these enjoyments that can be gained only by work, and then craves more rest and more opportunities for activities that are themselves pleasurable. No universal rule can be laid down, but experience seems to show that the more ignorant and phlegmatic of races and of individuals, especially if they live in a southern clime, will stay at their work a shorter time, and will exert themselves less while at it, if the rate of pay rises so as to give them their accustomed enjoyments in return for less work than before. But those whose mental horizon is wider, and who have more firmness and elasticity of character, will work the harder and the longer, the higher the rate of pay which is open to them, unless indeed they prefer to divert their activities to higher aims than work for material gain. But this point will need to be discussed more fully under the head of the influence of progress on value. Meanwhile, we may conclude that increased remuneration causes an immediate increase in the supply of efficient work, as a rule, and that the exceptions to this rule, just noticed, are seldom on a large scale, though they are not devoid of significance. When, however, we turn from the immediate influence exerted by a rise in wages on the work done by an individual to its ultimate effect after a generation or two, the result is less uncertain. It is indeed true that, though a temporary improvement will give a good many young people the opportunity to marry and set up house, for which they have been waiting, yet a permanent increase of prosperity is quite as likely to lower as to raise the birth rate. But, on the other hand, an increase of wages is almost certain to diminish the death rate, unless it has been obtained at the price of the neglect by mothers of their duties to their children. And the case is much stronger when we look at the influence of high wages on the physical and mental vigor of the coming generation. For there is a certain consumption which is strictly necessary for each grade of work in this sense, that if any of it is curtailed, the work cannot be done efficiently. The adults might indeed take good care of themselves at the expense of their children, but that would only defer the decay of efficiency for one generation. Further, there are conventional necessaries which are so strictly demanded by custom and habit that in fact people generally would give up much of their necessaries, strictly so called, rather than go without the greater part of these. Thirdly, there are habitual comforts, which some, though not all, would not entirely relinquish even when hardly pressed. Many of these conventional necessaries and customary comforts are the embodiment of material and moral progress, and their extent varies from age to age and from place to place. The greater they are, the less economical is man as an agent of production. But if they are wisely chosen, they attain in the highest degree the end of all production, for they then raise the tone of human life. Any increase in consumption that is strictly necessary to efficiency pays its own way and adds to, as much as it draws from, the national dividend. But an increase of consumption that is not thus necessary can be afforded only through an increase in man's command over nature, and that can come about through an advance in knowledge and the arts of production, through improved organization and access to larger and richer sources of raw material, and lastly, through the growth of capital and the material means of attaining desired ends in any form. Thus, the question how closely the supply of labor responds to the demand for it is in a great measure resolved into the question how great a part of the present consumption of the people at large consists of necessaries, strictly so called, for the life and efficiency of young and old. How much consists of conventional necessaries which theoretically could be dispensed with, but practically would be preferred by the majority of people to some of those things that were really necessary for efficiency, and how much is really superfluous, regarded as a means toward production, though of course part of it may be of supreme importance, regarded as an end in itself. The earlier French and English economists, as we noted at the beginning of the preceding chapter, classed nearly all the consumption of the working classes under the first head. They did so partly for simplicity and partly because those classes were then poor in England and very poor in France, and they inferred that the supply of labor would correspond to changes in the effective demand for it in the same way, though of course not quite as fast as that of machinery would. And an answer not very different from theirs must be given to the question with regard to the less advanced countries even now. For throughout the greater part of the world, the working classes can afford but few luxuries and not even many conventional necessaries, and any increase in their earnings would result in so great an increase of their numbers as to bring down their earnings quickly to nearly the old level at their mere expense of rearing. Over a greater part of the world, wages are governed nearly after the so-called iron or brazen law, which ties them close to the cost of rearing and sustaining a rather inefficient class of laborers. As regards the modern Western world, the answer is materially different. So great has been the recent advance in knowledge and freedom, in vigor, in wealth, and in the easy access to rich, distant fields for the supply of food and raw material. But it is still true, even in England today, that much the greater part of the consumption of the main body of the population conduces to sustain life and vigor, not perhaps in the most economical manner, but yet without any great waste. Doubtless, some indulgences are positively harmful, but these are diminishing relatively to the rest, the chief exception, perhaps, being that of gambling. Most of that expenditure, which is not strictly economical as a means toward efficiency, yet helps to form habits of ready, resourceful enterprise, and gives that variety to life, without which men become dull and stagnant and achieve little, though they may plod much, and it is well recognized that even in Western countries, skilled labor is generally the cheapest where wages are the highest. It may be admitted that the industrial development of Japan is tending to show that some of the more expensive conventional necessaries might conceivably be given up without a corresponding diminution of efficiency. But, though this expenditure may be fruitful of far-reaching results in the future, yet it has little bearing on the past and the present. It remains true that, taking man as he is, and has been hitherto, in the Western world, the earnings that are got by efficient labor are not much above the lowest that are needed to cover the expenses of rearing and training efficient workers, and of sustaining and bringing into activity their full energies. We conclude then that an increase of wages, unless earned under unwholesome conditions, almost always increases the strength, physical, mental, and even moral of the coming generation, and that, other things being equal, an increase in the earnings that are to be got by labor increases its rate of growth, or in other words, a rise in its demand price increases the supply of it. If the state of knowledge and of social and domestic habits be given, then the vigor of the people as a whole, if not their numbers, and both the numbers of vigor of any trade in particular, may be said to have a supply price in this sense, that there is a certain level of the demand price which will keep them stationary, that a higher price would cause them to increase, and that a lower price would cause them to decrease. Thus, again, we see that demand and supply exert coordinate influences on wages. Neither has a claim to predominance any more than either has a blade of a pair of scissors, or either pier of an arch. Wages tend to equal the net product of labor. Its marginal productivity rules the demand price for it. And on the other side, wages tend to retain a close, though indirect and intricate relation with the cost of rearing, training, and sustaining the energy of efficient labor. The various elements of the problem mutually determine, in the sense of governing, one another, and incidentally, this secures that supply price and demand price tend to equality. Wages are not governed by demand price nor by supply price, but the whole set of causes which govern demand and supply. A word should be said as to the common phrase, the general rate of wages, or the wages of labor in general. Such phrases are convenient in a broad view of distribution, and especially when we are considering the general relations of capital and labor. But in fact, there is no such thing in modern civilization as a general rate of wages. Each of 100 or more groups of workers has its own wage problem, its own set of special causes, natural and artificial, controlling the supply price and limiting the number of its members. Each has its own demand price governed by the need that other agents of production have of its services. Somewhat similar difficulties arise with regard to the phrase the general rate of interest. But here the chief trouble comes from the fact that the income derived from capital already invested in particular things, such as factories or ships, is properly a quasi-rent and can be regarded as interest only on the assumption that the capital value of the investment has remained unaltered. Leaving this difficulty on one side for the present, and recollecting that the phrase the general rate of interest applies in strictness only to the anticipated net earnings from new investments of free capital, we may resume briefly the results of our earlier studies of the growth of capital. We have seen that the accumulation of wealth is governed by a great variety of causes, by custom, by habits of self-control and of realizing the future, and above all by the power of family affection. Security is a necessary condition for it, and the progress of knowledge and intelligence furthers it in many ways. But though saving in general is affected by many causes other than the rate of interest, and though the saving of many people is but little affected by the rate of interest, while a few who have determined to secure an income of a certain fixed amount for themselves or their family will save less with a high rate than with a low rate of interest, yet a strong balance of evidence seems to rest with the opinion that a rise in the rate of interest or demand price for saving tends to increase the volume of saving. Thus then, interest, being the price paid for the use of capital in any market, tends towards an equilibrium level such that the aggregate demand for capital in that market at that rate of interest is equal to the aggregate stock forthcoming there at that rate. If the market which we are considering is a small one, say a single town or a single trade in a progressive country, an increased demand for capital in it will be promptly met by an increased supply drawn from surrounding districts or trades. But if we are considering the whole world, or even the whole of a large country as one market for capital, we cannot regard the aggregate supply of it as altered quickly and to a considerable extent by a change in the rate of interest. For the general fund of capital is the product of labor and waiting, and the extra work and the extra waiting, to which a rise in the rate of interest would act as an incentive, would not quickly amount to much as compared with the work and waiting, of which the total existing stock of capital is the result. An extensive increase in the demand for capital in general will therefore be met for a time, not so much by an increase of supply as by a rise in the rate of interest, which will cause capital to withdraw itself partially from those uses in which its marginal utility is lowest. It is only slowly and gradually that the rise in the rate of interest will increase the total stock of capital. Land is on a different footing from man himself and those agents of production which are made by man, among which are included improvements made by him on the land itself. For while the supplies of all other agents of production respond in various degrees and various ways to the demand for their services, land makes no such response. Thus, an exceptional rise in the earnings of any class of labor tends to increase its numbers or efficiency or both, and the increase in the supply of efficient work of that class tends to cheapen the services which it renders to the community. If the increase is in their numbers, then the rate of earnings of each will tend downwards towards the old level. But if the increase is in their efficiency, then, though they will probably earn more per head than before, the gain to them will come from an increased national dividend, and will not be at the expense of other agents of production. And the same is true as regards capital, but not true as regards land. While, therefore, the value of land, in common with the values of other agents of production, is subject to those influences which were discussed towards the end of the preceding chapter, it is not subject to those which have been brought into the reckoning in the present discussion. It is true that land is but a particular form of capital from the point of view of the individual manufacturer or cultivator, and land shares the influences of the laws of demand and of substitution, which were discussed in the last chapter, because the existing stock of it, like the existing stock of capital or of labor of any kind, tends to be shifted from one use to another till nothing could be gained for production by any further shifting. And so far as the discussions of the last chapter are concerned, the income that is derived from a factory, a warehouse, or a plow, allowance being made for wear and tear, etc., is governed in the same way as is the income from land. In each case, the income tends to equal the value of the marginal net product of the agent. In each case, this is governed for the time by the total stock of the agent and the need that other agents have of its aid. That is one side of the question. The other is that land in an old country does not share the reflex influences discussed in this chapter, which a high rate of earnings exerts on the supply of other agents of production, and consequently on their contributions to the national dividend, and consequently on the real cost at which their services are purchased by other agents of production. The building an additional floor on one factory or putting an extra plow on one farm does not generally take a floor from another factory or a plow from another farm. The nation adds a factory floor or a plow to its business as the individual does to his. There is thus a larger national dividend which is to be shared out, and in the long run the increased earnings of the manufacturer or farmer are not as a rule at the cost of other producers. In contrast to this, the stock of land in an old country at any time is the stock for all time, and when a manufacturer or cultivator decides to take in a little more land to his business, he decides in effect to take it away from someone else's business. He adds a little more land to his business, but the nation adds no land to its business. The change does not in itself increase the national income. To conclude this stage of our argument, the net aggregate of all the commodities produced is itself the true source from which flow the demand prices for all these commodities, and therefore for the agents of production used in making them. Or, to put the same thing in another way, this national dividend is at once the aggregate net product of, and the sole source of payment for, all the agents of production within the country. It is divided up into earnings of labor, interest of capital, lastly, the producer's surplus or rent of land and of other differential advantages for production. It constitutes the whole of them, and the whole of it is distributed among them. And the larger it is, the larger, other things being equal, will be the share of each of them. It is distributed among them, speaking generally, in proportion to the need which people have for their several services, i.e., not the total need, but the marginal need. By this is meant the need at that point at which people are indifferent whether they purchase a little more of the services or the fruits of the services of one agent, or devote their further resources to purchasing the services or the fruits of the services of other agents. Other things being equal, each agent is likely to increase the faster, the larger the share which it gets, unless indeed it is not capable of being increased at all. But every such increase will do something towards filling up the more urgent needs for that agent, and will thus lessen the marginal need for it, and lower the price at which it can find a market. That is to say, an increase in the proportionate share or rate of remuneration of any agent is likely to bring into play forces that will reduce that share and leave a larger proportionate share of the dividend to be shared among others. This reflex action may be slow, but if there is no violent change in the arts of production or in the general economic condition of society, the supply of each agent will be closely governed by its cost of production, account being taken of those conventional necessaries which constantly expand as the growing richness of the national income yields to one class after another an increasing surplus above the mere necessaries for efficiency. In studying the influence which increased efficiency and increased earnings in one trade exert on the condition of others, we may start from the general fact that, other things being equal, the larger the supply of any agent of production, the further it will have to push its way into uses for which it is not specially fitted. The lower will be the demand price with which it will have to be contented in those uses in which its employment is on the verge or margin of not being found profitable. And insofar as competition equalizes the price which it gets in all uses, this price will be its price for all uses. The extra production resulting from the increase in that agent of production will go on to swell the national dividend, and other agents of production will benefit thereby, but that agent itself will have to submit to a lower rate of pay. For instance, if without any other change capital increases fast, the rate of interest must fall. If without any other change the number of those ready to do any particular kind of labor increases, their wages must fall. In either case, there will result an increased production and an increased national dividend. In either case, the loss of one agent of production must result in a gain to others, but not necessarily to all others. Thus, the opening up of rich quarries of slate, or the increase in numbers or efficiency of quarrymen, would tend to improve the houses of all classes, and it would tend to increase the demand
Okay,
for
thank you,
bricklayers.
Alfred Marshall. Okay, so running a little late here, but hey, it's live radio, live YouTube. That's right, I'm live right now on YouTube as well. They've actually got a chat room there, so if you're a radio listener, might want to check out the YouTube feed, live streaming right now. They got a chat room there, so that's all cool. By the way, if you want to call in, I mean, you can interact with the show that way, but you can also call into the show if you like. And that number is 657-383-1825. 657-383-1825. Give us a call. Be a part of the big show. All right. Pinpointing. Pinpointing as a critical management skill. Next to the delivery of positive reinforcement, the single most important skill for we talked about this, continuing on from yesterday, where yesterday's discussion where we were talking about positive reinforcement. The single most important skill for anyone attempting to change the behavior of others is the skill of pinpointing. Okay. The skill of pinpointing. The term pinpointing simply means being precise. Unfortunately, most people asking for behavior change think they are being precise even while the person being asked to change is forced to guess at the criterion for success. For example, it is very common to hear people tell someone, you have to change your attitude. People who are attempting to reduce some behavior all too often say things such as, pay attention to what you are doing. Even less productive is telling others to stop doing something with instructions like, Quit making errors or stop being so careless. If you really want or need a change in performance, the key to success begins with precisely defining or pinpointing your expectations. Characteristics of pinpoints. While you may begin the change process with a generic statement of the problem, you must ultimately break it down into its components. For example, consider the term lazy. An employee who is called lazy may come to work late, take long breaks, have a high error rate, and never volunteer to help others on the team. All of these things describe the specific aspects of what might be termed lazy. Pinpointing is the process of being specific about what people do. The specifics may be either the behaviors of the performer or the results produced by the behaviors. Therefore, pinpoints consist of behaviors and results. Behavior consists of someone's actions. It is what you actually see if you observe someone working. The individual may be typing, talking to a customer on the telephone, making a presentation to upper management about a proposed project, drilling holes, or teaching a class. These are all behaviors. Results are the outcomes or products of behavior. A result is what is left when the behavior is completed. You may observe the result independent of the performer. That is, you do not have to see the performer to see his or her output. Results, in fact, tell you nothing about behavior unless you see the behavior that creates the output. You must infer actions. Your inferences could be wrong. If you own a coffee shop and count $600 in receipts at the end of the day, you may take on faith that your shopkeeper sold that much in merchandise. More store owners, however, verify these facts by cross-referencing inventory and receipts on a regular basis. They also frequently theft from the failure to ring up an item or from an undocumented refund or unequal exchange. Are the staff consuming product? Was the product entered into inventory correctly? The physical results rarely answer the questions as to what the performers did to accomplish this outcome. Anyone who tries to manage by results only is making a fundamental mistake. We concern ourselves with results because that is the primary interest of organizations. Gilbert captures this when he talks about worthy accomplishments, costly behavior. We value behavior only in relationship to its output. If we do not value the output, we will not value the effort to produce it. Results are usually pinpointed first to make sure that you do not consume time with reinforcing behaviors that produce no value to the organization. Deming in 1986 and his associates have focused much attention on the fact that if a system is in control, then it is inappropriate to either punish or reward the performer for changes in the results because they are being produced by normal variation in the system and not by changes in the behavior of the employees. If you have not pinpointed the behaviors you want from the beginning, you will be unable to determine if changes in the results are performer produced or system produced. Behavior counts are sometimes mistaken for results. In a call center operation, for instance, performances such as calls answered, time to answer calls, calls dropped, and the time an operator is available for calls are all measured. That is, each individual action is counted. The same is true in sports, where we measure balls thrown for a pitcher and balls hit for a batter. When you pinpoint behaviors to the extent that you can do frequency counts of them, you have increased your ability to change behavior substantially. Some managers spend too much management time with nuisance behaviors such as taking long breaks. The challenge is to ensure that you are dealing with the real issue and not a symptom. If, for example, the real concern is productivity, then it is probably a waste of management's time to focus on the break issue because people can be at their desks or workstations and still not produce much of anything. Activities that produce no measurable outcome must be called into question if they consume personnel and material resources. Pinpointing behaviors and results. Every job has specific behaviors and specific results associated with it. If you cannot recognize the difference between them, you might manage only results or only behaviors. Either strategy often creates problems in the long run. When you pinpoint behaviors only, you may not always get the desired results. When you pinpoint results only, you may inadvertently reinforce the wrong behaviors. Enron is a case study in how to mismanage both behaviors and results. People there were reinforced for breaking all the rules. So rogue outfits were created within the organization, but outside of the management hierarchy. Some people were reinforced so lavishly that they repeatedly violated commonly understood rules of ethics and law. The lesson highlighted by Enron is that you will get more of what you reinforce. So you should pay attention not only to the results, but the behaviors that made them possible. Some behaviors lead to the desired results and others do not. For example, we often emphasize attendance and short breaks for clerical personnel. Coming to work and taking breaks are behaviors. The problem is that the poorest performer in the organization could be someone who takes no breaks and has perfect attendance. Without results, these behaviors have little value in and of themselves. Yet, results are often overemphasized. Sales managers typically hold their salespeople accountable for meeting sales quotas. Meeting the quota is a result. Sales managers may ignore the behaviors that are important for making a sale and reinforce or punish salespeople for producing or not producing results. Failure to meet a quota is a serious problem in the typical sales organization. And the usual management response is to punish the performer in some way. But instead of punishing for not meeting quotas, managers should tell performers specific behaviors for making sales, such as getting lists of prospects, calling them, making appointments, preparing presentations, etc. Then managers should give the performer feedback and reinforcement for any improvement. If the salespeople do these things and still do not make sales, it might be an indication that the manager has not pinpointed the critical behaviors for the result of making a sale. Pinpointing behavior. Pinpointing behavior involves two challenges. The first is separating behavior from non-behaviors, and the second is determining whether or not the behavior you select will drive the outcome you want. You overcome these challenges by simplifying and testing the effectiveness of your pinpoint. To simplify, pinpointing behaviors, describe them in terms of observable muscle movement. This implies that you must see the behavior you have described, and that behavior must involve physical action of the performer. This is consistent with Lindsley's 1965 observation that behaviors are verbs and results are nouns. Even this guideline can be troublesome if you fail to attend to the requirement for physical movement. Some verbs, such as supervise, lead, analyze, or delegate, have no physical component that can be observed at any particular point in time. Just because a verb has an ing form does not mean we are describing behavior. A common but inaccurate description of project management behavior is meeting deadlines. This defines an outcome, not a behavior. At the moment the deadline is met, what do you observe the performer actually doing? Probably you see him or her place a document in your inbox, or you might see them click the send button on their email. You should always pinpoint the results you want before you describe the necessary behaviors. When you pinpoint behaviors, you are in essence developing a hypothesis that the behaviors you have identified are the critical components of some desired result. If you are the person asking for the change, establishing the validity of this relationship is your responsibility. Unfortunately, managers commonly tell people what to do and then blame them when the desired outcome is not produced. These managers never validate the relationships of behavior to results because they are sure of the linkage, even when it does not exist. They then blame the performer. If you had just done what I told you, when the result is not forthcoming because he or she did not do the required behaviors. Managers frequently do not get the feedback that the failure was a failure to pinpoint correctly, not a failure of execution. As a result, the manager never learns to improve his or her pinpointing skills, and the performer is forced to guess what the real behavior requirements are. Pinpointing, very important. You got to know what you want, what it is you want. Writing pinpoints. Results pinpoints. While not perfect, simple templates are available that will help you state your expectations in the most accurate form. Since behaviors are usually important because of their impact on outcomes, you should begin by defining the result. The templates for result pinpoints contain three components: the direction of change, the units of measure, and the pinpoint itself. Always begin by pinpointing a result you want to increase. If the direction of change is either to reduce something or to maintain something, try again. While there may be traditional measures for which a decrease is appropriate, finding a way to turn it into an increase almost always leads to a re-examination of the process you are measuring and new insights into what success looks like. When trying to maintain some level of performance, managers are usually measuring performance at too broad a level. Thus, if the goal is to maintain machine reliability at 100%, you should be pinpointing measures of performance that are subordinate to maintenance of machine reliability. Those subordinate measures will be leading indicators of your ability to achieve 100% maintenance of machine reliability. These might be measures of the number of preventative maintenance work orders completed on schedule or measures of the frequency of predictive measures read and trended. Okay, the second element for stating an accurate pinpoint is the unit of measurement you will use. Is it pounds, number, volume, rate, dollars, or some other measure of outcome? While percent as a measure is somewhat problematic, there are still times that percent is a convenient way to express performance in relation to a goal. The third element is the pinpoint itself. A simple test of its effectiveness is to see if the measurement selected is an accurate reflection of the pinpoint as stated. A sales pinpoint to increase sales measured in dollar value to new customers might not be accurate if what you are really trying to do is increase the number of new customers. When the measure and the words agree, you very likely have a well-defined, pinpointed result. Let's see, behavior, what people are doing. Results, what people have produced. Oh, okay, what people are doing. Okay, behavior, what people are doing. 2, what you see people do when they are working. Results, what you see after people stop working. Behavior number 3, must see people working. Results number 3, not necessary to see people working. Behavior number 4 tends to be expressed in present tense verbs ending in ing. Results number 4 tends to be expressed in the past tense by noun adjective pairings, documents filed. Behavior number 5, cue words by, through, and to. Results number 5, cue words and phrases in order to, so that, to achieve, to be able to. Behavior number 6, commonly used terms, input, process, activity, means. Results number 6, commonly used terms, output, product, outcome, achievement, ends. Behavior number 7, examples, inspecting, designing, conducting meetings, reinforcing, giving feedback. Results number 7, examples, production, yield, run time, milestones met, suggestions made. Okay, behavior pinpoints. There are 4 components to a behavior pinpoint. They are action, object, condition, and criterion. While not all 4 are necessary for every pinpoint, you must check to ensure that an omission does not deprive the performer of vital information. Every behavior is an action. It is something someone is doing, so this verb may be stated in the active rather than the passive form. Each behavior has an object of the action or the thing being acted upon. This pair, action and object, forms the basis for all behavior pinpoints. It may help you to think of this action-object pairing as the verb and object of the verb. Examples might be as follows: tell her, pick it up, put it there, drink your milk. Take care that the action is actually a physical movement that can be observed. The statement, delegate the task, might seem to meet the criteria of action and object, but it really fails because delegate is not a physical movement, nor can it be observed without being interpreted. A more accurate pinpoint, such as complete the review of the new marketing materials and provide your analysis by noon on Monday, does meet this criteria since it is clearly observable. The less skilled or the more uncertain the performer, the more likely you will have to state the conditions and the criteria for the behavior. You frequently have to tell new hires when condition to do the behavior and when to stop criteria. You frequently must state both criteria and condition when writing procedures and policies. Teaching a new employee the basics of the operations might require statements such as open the doors at 8 a.m. each morning. With that statement, you are stating the condition or when to engage in the behavior. Or you might make a statement like squeeze the gas pump handle until it clicks. This tells them when the job is done. Criterion. When dangers or risks of severe harm exist that are unknown to the performer, even if the probability for harm is low, you must describe your requirements using all four pinpoint components. For instance, when overhead work is being performed, you might require the workers to tie off their safety harnesses to a weight-bearing structure when working higher than 4 feet above the ground. You might warn them that if the indicator light illuminates, they must reduce the engine speed below 9,000 RPM. Conditions and criteria tell the performer when and how much behavior is required. Not all behavior pinpoints require conditions and criteria, but all pinpointed behaviors do require action and object. The requirement for adding condition and or criteria is indicated when the skill level of the performer is low or when meeting both condition and criterion is critical to success. Measurement. Once you have pinpointed the behavior and the result you would like to change, you are ready to begin measuring. If you have a reliable pinpoint, measurement is easy. The most basic measurement is counting. Pinpoints allow you to count because the specificity of a pinpoint enables you to observe actions you would not otherwise see. As you will learn, pinpointing allows you to measure many abstract performances or states such as morale, attitude, and creativity. Once you have established the precise behaviors, you will accept as evidence of these qualities. Counting them is a simple task. Why measure? Just as we manage organizational performance by data, we should manage human performance by data. If we pinpoint what we want from people, the next logical step is to measure their performance. In many organizations, problems sometimes arise when we start measuring what people do. People may say things like, "You can't measure what I do," "You don't trust me," or "It's not fair." You might even hear comments about your micromanagement. These comments indicate that the performers may have had a history in which measurement has been an antecedent for punishment. This is understandable because a lot of what we measure is negative. We measure things like errors, defects, accidents, and waste. Quite naturally, people might not be delighted when someone suggests counting the number of errors they make. We want to ensure that you look at measurement in terms of how it can be used to support positive change. In that sense, the measurement process is much more likely to be associated with reinforcement than with punishment. One major reason for measuring in a PM or a performance management system is to increase the appropriate delivery of reinforcement. Measurement allows you to see smaller changes in performance than you could see through casual observation. Seeing these small improvements allows you to reinforce more often. This will guarantee faster change than if you wait until some final result has been attained. Certainly, measurement exposes poor performance, but knowing about poor performance helps us know when improvement occurs so we can positively reinforce the desired performance. Another reason for measuring is to increase your own skills at influencing others. As with any skill, the more precise the feedback you get, the faster you learn how to get others to do what you want them to do. You will also get them to do it because they want to please you rather than because they feel coerced. When you measure the behavior you want to change, you will be able to see how quickly the change takes place. The changes take place. The data will also give you important clues as to whether these changes are the product of positive or negative reinforcement. Progress requires measurement. Measurement is the key to progress. In many areas of past human endeavor, progress was slow until effective measurement techniques were devised. The telescope and microscope, for example, generated great advances in astronomy and biology because they allowed better and more precise measurement than was possible with the naked eye. New measurement technologies have accelerated progress in science, technology, and business for the same reason. Similarly, human performance benefits from advances in measurement because it permits us to detect subtle changes in behavior. If you do not measure, you usually cannot tell if performance is getting better, getting worse, or staying the same. Until those conditions, under those conditions, improvement results from chance rather than from rational planning and evaluation. Feedback and reinforcement require measurement. Feedback, useful information on performance, is an essential part of performance management. Therefore, the effective application of PM requires measurement. Feedback depends on data obtained by measuring relevant performance. How are people to know how they are doing if their performance is not measured? Optimal performance also requires reinforcement. Measurement increases the effectiveness of reinforcement because data helps you separate real from apparent change. Without measurement, you may think there is an improvement when there is not, or vice versa. Without data, you may reinforce the wrong behavior or reinforce at the wrong time. In other words, data helps you plan what and when to reinforce. By watching the data, even small improvements can be detected and reinforced when appropriate. Measurement also helps you identify positive reinforcers by giving you a way to measure the effect of various reinforcers on performance. You may think you have an effective reinforcer to apply to someone's behavior. But if the behavior doesn't increase, then what you are using is not a reinforcer. By measuring the effect of the intended reinforcer on behavior, you can discover this earlier than you would without measurement. Data also will inform you of when the value of the reinforcer you have been using is beginning to lose its effect through satiation. If the performance begins to decline over time, data will show that the value of the reinforcer has changed. With data, you can correct the problem before a serious deterioration in performance occurs. Measuring increases credibility. A popular saying among some quality professionals is, "In God we trust, all others bring data." They say this because solutions are often found by analyzing data. So those with data are more likely to have solutions. People perceive individuals who support their points with data as being objective and persuasive. Furthermore, those who offer solutions are more likely to command respect and have more influence in decision making. Ultimately, when people disagree, the one with the data is most likely to prevail. Measuring reduces emotionalism and increases constructive problem solving. Using objective, unbiased data on performance reduces emotionalism. People get upset when they do not understand why someone says they are not doing well. Measurement helps us communicate the specifics of performance. If people understand why you have made a particular decision about performance, they are more likely to calmly discuss and accept the decision because they understand that your action is not arbitrary but based on fact. Managing effectively requires performance data. If you do not have data to support your assessments, you may appear opinionated, subjective, and irrational. When data is continually collected and openly displayed, performance trends become more apparent. This allows the performer to take action to correct problems sooner than would be possible if they did not have measurement. The introduction of statistical process control, or SPC, methods of Short in 1939, as cited in Deming 1986, and others, has made it possible for companies to make significant improvements in quality. With these measures, managers can separate variance in the process from variance in the performer. Therefore, when these measures are available, if performance is down as a result of variation in a process that is out of the performer's control, performers are less likely to be blamed. Another significant benefit of SPC is that the data tells performers when to take action to keep their process in control. Data also increases the probability that you will make the right decisions about promotions, suspensions, performance appraisals, and of course, positive reinforcement. People who have the appropriate data have a clearer basis for devising effective solutions to problems. For example, displaying data at crew, shift, sales, or other meetings puts the focus on performance, not on excuses. As a necessary condition for developing and maintaining optimal performance, measurement is one of the key attributes of performance management. Moving on. Measurement methods. There are two major measurement methods, counting and judging. While counting is preferred because of greater reliability, judgment can be a valid way of measuring. It allows us to get the benefit of measuring in areas that would otherwise go unmeasured. Counting. Counting is very straightforward. We can count the number of parts made, engineering, drawings completed, lines of computer code written, or hours of overtime. Counting is the preferred method of measuring because practically everybody can do it, and with a high degree of reliability. It is easy and usually can be completed quickly. Another advantage of counting is that when we do not need to count every instant of a behavior or result, we can sample. Sampling involves counting at random times or inspecting random units of production. The process of sampling is highly scientific, and as such, there are rules about how to select a sample and how many observations or counts constitute a representative sample. Most statistical books cover this subject in detail. Those listening who have been trained in statistical process control are very familiar with sampling methods and processes. Nevertheless, sampling errors are common in business and everyday life. We often draw conclusions about behavior and results based on too little information. If you are not counting every occurrence of something, you must make sure you have counted enough instances to have an adequate sample. Okay. Judgment. When the pinpoints you have selected cannot be made specific enough to permit counting, you can use the judgment technique of measuring. Judgment is the process of forming an opinion or evaluation by discerning and comparing. Even though judgment is less reliable and more subjective than counting, it has at least two very practical uses in performance management. First, judgment allows you to measure any performance. Second, in most cases, when you use judgment measures, you discover new ways to count, and counting is almost always preferred to judgment. However, when you cannot count, there are four techniques that are used in making judgments about performance. They are: 1, opinion-based ranking; 2, opinion-based rating; 3, criteria-based ranking; and 4, criteria-based rating. Okay, so let's see. Cell 1, cell 2. So there's just a graphic I created here, an exhibit, which I don't think would translate very well into radio. So that happens. By the way, if you want to check out the blog, I've got all kinds of great exhibits and figures and charts and graphs that I put together. And that's charleslanson.blogspot.com. There's all kinds of useful information there for people in business. Okay, let's see here. I know that's pretty general, but you know what I'm trying to say. Management. finance, economics, business administration, organizational communication with an emphasis in promotions. We got it all. Or other way, AKA public relations, AKA propaganda. If each time you rate or rank, you get a little more specific, you will be surprised at how quickly you increase the reliability of your judgments. For example, suppose we have a supervisor who wants to measure a mechanic's neatness, but doesn't know exactly how to do it. Let's start by asking the supervisor to rate the performer on a neatness scale, where 0 is the messiest mechanic he has ever known, and 10 is the neatest mechanic he has ever known. Also, at the end of the job, ask the mechanic to rate himself. Then compare the ratings. If they both agree, the supervisor has some evidence that they are measuring neatness in similar ways. Most often, they will not agree. What the mechanic sees is very good, an 8 on the scale. The supervisor may see as average, a 5. This will immediately cause questions to come up like, why did you give me a 5? Or why did you give yourself an 8? The answers to these questions will add more definition to the scale so that with repeated measures, their ratings will match on more items. Over time, this opinion-based measure can be made more objective by specifying distinct criteria for judging performance. Once this happens, judgments can be made on the basis of observation. Let's assume one element in neatness is to clean up the debris produced before leaving the job. This creates what is referred to as a pre-established criterion. Okay. All right, so while this is most effective judgment technique, can be improved by, let's see here. It can be improved by making it a behaviorally anchored rating scale, BARS, bars. Here, examples of the value neatness, in this case, are given to each rater who scores it on the selected scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, etc. The scores are averaged so that each example has a common perceived rating. The description picks up tools and debris, organizes area, wipes surface clean, for example, might merit a value of 7.3 with bars. We find enough descriptors to discriminate between several levels of performance. This method has the advantage of promoting greater inter-rater reliability so that judgments are not perceived as being capricious or as unique to an individual rater. Rank or rate. So we can rank or rate. Ranking involves comparing the performances of individuals against each other. You simply decide whether the performance you are considering is better or worse than the one closest to it. You are in effect lining up the performers from best to worst. Using ranked scores may cause problems when the results are fed back to the performers. When you rank how well people do, you distribute performance measures across the whole range from best to worst. In other words, you establish only one winner, just as the typical contest does. If you have only one winner, you limit reinforcement for all other performers. thereby ultimately reducing the overall performance. Even if you have a hierarchy of winners, first, second, third place, etc., you are creating a diminishing distribution of reinforcement. Since behavior is a function of its reinforcement, ranking should be used only when ratings are impractical. Performances are judged independently when using ratings, thus avoiding the problem of limiting reinforcement encountered in ranking systems. In a ranking system, all performers could attain a perfect score at the same time. So the fact that you get reinforced for what you do does not reduce the reinforcement others experience for what they do. Many performance appraisal processes use a ranking system but call the scores a rating. This is because so many systems try to accomplish incompatible outcomes with the same instrument. One is the attempt to distribute a limited amount of any reinforcer, money, promotion, etc. This will require ranking. Only if the reinforcer is unlimited can you use a rating system. The other part of the appraisal process is to improve performance. This requires reinforcement based on what the individual accomplishes and should not be limited by what others do or don't do. In fact, it should not be limited at all, since increases in reinforcement increase the rate of change. Calling the hybrid score used in most appraisal systems by the more benign name rating does not change its nature or its function. If your ratings are based on opinion, your labels will be terms like poor to excellent or never to very often. Your judgments involve only your impressions of the performance and do not eventually move to rate pre-established criteria. Your measure is probably not important to the performer. Okay, if it is important, the performers will want to know why they received the ratings they did and what they have to do to get a higher score. When you are able to tell them, you will have what you need to develop a pre-established criterion scale. You will have. Oh, okay. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, ladies and gents, this is the end of the big show. I want to thank you all for tuning in. And tomorrow, let's see here. Or tomorrow. Yeah, I'm not 100. I don't know if I'm going to be doing a show tomorrow or not. Yeah. So, but the next show, we're going to channel the spirit. We're going to have another seance. We're going to channel the spirit of Alfred Marshall again. And we're going to talk about his principles of economics. And we're going to talk more about this performance management. But thank you all for tuning in. You all have a great day. And stay out of trouble. And don't take any wooden nickels.